How do you pick the best color space for photography? In this video, we'll look at both theory and real examples. But for those of you who just want the answer, I recommend ProPhoto or Rec 2020 for your layered files. P3 or Rec 2020 is ideal for the web when it's supported during upload. Otherwise, sRGB is always safe if a little bit boring. Okay, let's dig in. We're going to use ColorSync Utility, which is a free program that comes with a Mac operating system. We'll go to Profiles, go to RGB Profiles, and you can see everything that's installed on my computer. And I'm going to go down to sRGB since this is the space that is kind of the least common denominator for color. You'll never use anything smaller than this. And you will notice there's a couple installed here. This one is the one that comes with the Mac operating system. This is the one that Adobe installs for me. They're actually pretty much identical, so there's no real difference here. So I'm going to take this, and then you can click and drag and move around to visualize the space, but this doesn't look very intuitive. If you right click, you can choose different visualizations. The one you want to look at is YUV. And then you can click and drag and you see now we see this familiar horseshoe. And notice that it's a three-dimensional space. We're used to looking down when we look on these spaces, when we look on, say, a website or something, because we can't show 3D. But color is actually three-dimensional. There's a luminosity component as well, right? So there are limits here to consider in a three-dimensional space. And this is especially important when we think about HDR, where this would get much taller. I can't show you this because we don't have ICC profiles for it yet, but this is another consideration, is just how bright you can get. And that does vary by color. And it'll come up in some of the examples we'll look at a little bit later. But let's just kind of look at it from this top-down view. This horseshoe represents all the colors that humans can see. And anything outside of this is something that we would not be able to visualize. But all these gaps in gray, these are colors that are not part of sRGB, but we could see. So this could be a bright blue sky or the ocean, or maybe some beautifully colored animal, some kind of bird or something like that. And we would lose that color in this space. So bigger color space would allow us to see more real colors. Let's compare to another option. If we go and click over to, say, Image P3, Display P3, they're basically the same. With Image P3 here, we have a wider gamut. And if we want to directly compare these, we can right click and choose Hold for Comparison. I like to hold on the one that's the bigger space. So now I see kind of a wireframe here. And then we can go back to sRGB. And you see here that everything that's kind of gray or ghosted outside, that's P3 where it exceeds the sRGB space. You can see exactly where there are gaps. Like P3 actually goes to brighter values of all these colors, and that's very helpful to look on a screen. And then of course, you have all these benefits where we get better cyans, better greens, better magentas, better reds, even a bit better yellows too. The only thing that isn't really improving are the extreme limits of blue. And if you look really closely there, they actually do get a little bit brighter. So even there is a benefit when you consider the three-dimensional space. And something like that height, that really is going to matter when it comes to something like high dynamic range HDR monitors, where this would get much, much taller if we're looking at an HDR color volume. But that is relevant even in the SDR space. So that's the minimal space of sRGB compared to something like P3. If we jump over to, say, Rec 2020, the next bigger space you might think about, well, now it fully encloses its space. Let's go and right click, hold it for comparison, and go look back at Image P3. So you can see that Rec 2020 completely includes all of the P3 space. So if you're in Rec 2020, you have all of P3, you have all of sRGB, because of course, if it fits P3, it also fits sRGB. And you can see that Rec 2020 is a much bigger color volume. This is the standard for modern displays. This is what everyone's trying to do. P3 realistically is where a lot of displays are today, like Apple monitors and all, but we're ultimately headed towards these Rec 2020 monitors. That's what you should be thinking about for the future of electronic display. So when we look at the comparisons here, right, we are getting, again, much brighter values of these colors. We're getting much better reds, magentas, blues, cyans. I mean, there's just a lot of additional color in Rec 2020 over P3. Well, what if we were to compare to some other spaces that you might be familiar with? So if we go look at, let's say, Adobe RGB, you can see that it's kind of about the same amount of color as P3, but it's shifted towards greens versus the reds. So both of these are fully within Rec 2020, meaning that if you use Rec 2020, you can always convert to these smaller spaces. You won't lose anything. So this is a great choice for your working files, and you can downgrade to these smaller spaces if you need. But how would these subtle ones compare. If we just look at those for a second. So let's go look at Adobe RGB, hold that and compare it to P3. So you see clearly P3 is getting those better reds and magentas. And then over here, we've got the Adobe RGB. And then when it comes to the volumes here, there's some differences in lumen. It's not huge differences overall, but certainly I would characterize this as P3 is better for monitors because that's the target we use today. And Adobe RGB is a little bit better aligned for printing. Let's take a closer look at that. So if we take Adobe RGB, let's hold this. And now let's go look at a really nice printer paper. Lumichrome has a nice wide gamut. This is about as good as it gets. And you can see Lumichrome even exceeds the limits of Adobe RGB, but certainly we remember that P3 wasn't quite as far. So if we're going to print with Lumichrome, let's go hold this for a second and just compare. P3 is losing all that color out here in this range. You're losing a lot of cyans and greens and such that if you're in Adobe RGB would keep. And that's why some people may prefer this as far as a reference for printing. But if you just work within Rec 2020, and we go back to that, notice the name here might change at some future point. This is just what Matt calls it, but if Adobe made this a default, it might be called Rec 2020, but just 2020 tells you. When you're working in Rec 2020, you have almost everything you can print there other than this little bit of sliver here. So yes, there are some limits to Rec 2020, but this is not all that consequential. You'd have to have a pretty unusual subject, like these are going to be darker shades of green, cyan, and blue. Maybe something like the ocean water might be a limit there where you decide Rec 2020 doesn't quite work for you. But generally speaking, I think this is the ideal color space because it includes almost everything that we can print. It includes everything we're going to show on a monitor, and it has no fake colors or anything that goes outside of the range of human vision. What if we compare this to ProPhoto? Because a lot of you know ProPhoto. So if we select that, let's hold that for comparison, and then let's pull up the Rec 2020. Well, obviously it's much bigger than Rec 2020 and fully includes it. So from a theoretical perspective, ProPhoto has everything, and you might select that, and there's nothing wrong with it. And if you're using that, if we go look back at our printer option, it fully encloses everything we can print. So ProPhoto is perhaps the ideal space if you never want to lose a color. But I would recommend Rec 2020. I don't think the loss there is something to really think about. And we look at ProPhoto, it has a lot of space dedicated to colors that don't exist, which can create some problems in some edge cases. And there's some other considerations we're not looking at here, like the gamma, where Rec 2020 is just better aligned with other work we do in other color spaces, which is why I recommend it. But ultimately, whether you want to use Rec 2020 or ProPhoto, they're both great choices for your original layered files, and you can always downgrade later. So never start your work in a smaller space like Adobe RGB, like P3, like sRGB. You can convert to them later. As long as you have a 16-bit file, I would go with Rec 2020 or go with ProPhoto. And ProPhoto is going to be easier for most of you today since Adobe just inherently supports it everywhere. Ideally in the future, we'd have as much support for Rec 2020 within Adobe software. So let's now switch over to Photoshop and look at some real examples. So I've opened up a raw smart object here in the ProPhoto space, and let's just compare what happens at kind of the raw phase, right? So going back to the original starting point of our image, when you're capturing your image in the camera, when you shoot raw, it doesn't really have a color space at that phase. But when you're in the raw editing environment, you do have a choice. In Lightroom, you won't really have a choice. It'll just always use ProPhoto for SDR or Rec 2020 for HDR for its representation of the histogram and the display. And then when you export from Lightroom, you'd be making a choice. When it comes to Adobe Camera Raw, this is where you make your choice, and it will affect the visualization you see here, which is kind of unique to ACR versus Lightroom. And let's just compare. Look at the histogram right now for ProPhoto. Nothing is blown out, but let's go switch this. If we click on this, and I'm going to move this out of the way, and just note that I've got the highlight clipping turned on in the histogram. If we go switch over to, let's say, Rec 2020, well, we're still in good shape. We did creep up a bit closer to the limits. Let's go take a look at display P3. Now we're starting to blow out a color channel because these reds do not exist in the P3 space. So if you choose P3 here, you're actually starting to clip your image and lose some detail. And you're getting kind of a misleading preview. I mean, if you're in Lightroom, you're always going to work in that bigger space. But if you tend to open up from Bridge into Adobe Camera Raw and use a smaller space here, you might back off your edit to preserve colors that you just don't have to do that for. If I am working in ProPhoto or Rec 2020, I know that nothing's lost and I can safely keep that color, and it might show up on a better monitor or on a printer. And I'm recording this video in sRGB. So I've actually forced my monitor down to sRGB so that I know that I'm not seeing anything you can't see. So normally my view of this image would be a bit better than what you can see here, but I've dumbed it down to the least common denominator just to make sure we're all looking at the same thing in this video. So when you're editing, you want to choose whatever space you want for your edit. And I would certainly go with ProPhoto or Rec 2020. And I like that Adobe Camera Raw has an option built right into it for Rec 2020. So that's what I would choose, and then just ideally be matched to your file. Let's cancel this. Let's close out of this. Then that gives you a sense of kind of the raw phase. Let's look at a real image where we can see more of a difference. So I've already gone ahead and opened up the image in Rec 2020, and my overall Photoshop document is in Rec 2020. But then I converted to P3, which loses color, and I converted to sRGB. And I did that in the raw environment. So I actually chose P3 here, and you can see there's, some blowouts. And then here I chose sRGB, and you can see again, there's even bigger blowouts of color, and you really see that red spike over here. So let's try and visualize this. Well, I'm recording this in sRGB, so it doesn't matter what I look at, whether it's Rec 2020 or sRGB, it's going to show the same thing. And the reason for that is Rec 2020 can always be clipped down to sRGB. So at this point, they seem like they're the same thing because my monitor is not showing me the benefit. But on a better monitor, I would definitely see the difference. And on a print, I would see the difference. I should be seeing more of an orange color in the sun and less of this yellow look. But because the red channel can't get any brighter, well, now it looks a little bit orange. So what I've done to help visualize this is I created an adjustment here to desaturate and darken a little bit so that it brings things down into kind of the range that we can see for sRGB. So the Rec 2020 now is kind of dumbed down into values that are safe for sRGB for comparison. And if we look at P3, now we can see that difference. So it always existed here, even though we couldn't see it on the monitor. It was available in the data, but now that we darken things down, now we can appreciate what that difference might look like. And you can see on a better monitor, you're getting a little bit better color here. Let's zoom into the sun a bit more so you can see that a little bit better. But I think from P3 versus Rec 2020, there's clearly some extra color here, and that's just going to make for a better sunset. And what about sRGB? Well, now we're really bringing things down here. You can see how it's going very, very yellow. Looks kind of dull. Look at the little highlights in the cloud here. From Rec 2020, you have a lot more separation and detail. There's more of a gradient. In sRGB, it's much more muted, and it almost looks a bit artifacted. Some of the edges here, I think, look a bit strange. So you can have this kind of bunching up of color when you're clamped down to the smaller sRGB space. And this just shows you visually why it's so important to work in something like Rec 2020. Let's keep all that original color in our edits, just work with a 16-bit file, you'll be in great shape. And then when you want to go and do your final export, you can always convert down to these smaller spaces. That's fine. You can always print in whatever space you need for printing. Just keep your layered file in the larger working space of Rec 2020 or ProPhoto. Let's look at one last theoretical example where I've got a document created in Rec 2020 so it can fully enclose the maximum Rec 2020 value. So I've created here all the primary and secondary colors. You can see the HSB readouts here are showing that the brightness is going from 10% to 20, 30, 40, all the way up to 100. So I've got kind of the full range of values in Rec 2020. Then I did something similar in P3 and brought it into this document. So these are P3 values converted to Rec 2020. You see them here looking the same right now because we're clamped down to sRGB in this video, but they are unique and Photoshop knows the difference. You notice that the values here are not the same, like cyan, right? I've got 100% cyan saturation here, but the P3 is only 51% saturated. So we can't appreciate the difference right now, but Photoshop knows the difference and it remembers. And then the sRGB next to it, and you see then we're down to like 39% saturation for cyan. So there's a huge difference here. And the fact we cannot see it on the monitor right now is not a problem, because if we edit the sRGB values we can see correctly, everything else is going to work out great. So don't worry about that. you always want your 16-bit layered file to be the wide gamut Rec 2020 or Pro Photo. Keep that color. It'll show up in a print. It'll look great on a better monitor. Don't worry about the things you can't see here. It's fine. But let's try and visualize what this actually looks like. And to do that, I've created an HSL adjustment with a minus 50% saturation. So we're just going to kind of dumb the colors down to the limits that'll work for an sRGB recording. Now you can see there are very clear differences. So the data was always in the file. We just couldn't see it on the monitor. When it comes to wide gamut or HDR, you can't always see it on your monitor, but the data is in the image as long as you don't convert the image down to something like sRGB. If we convert the image down to a less capable space, we would lose it. If I go and say edit, convert to profile, change to sRGB, well, now there are no differences, right? We've clamped the Rec 2020 P3 colors down to the least common denominator, to the sRGB. This is why you don't want to do this in your working file. Those were values we could have seen in a print or a better monitor. There's no sense in your working file to eliminate that color. You can always do it at the end, like we just did when you're exporting for the web, but don't do it right from the start. So let's step back. Let's get back our full color here. And let's just take a look at what we got. You notice, for example, cyans, right? P3 is much more saturated than the sRGB at every possible brightness. The P3 is more interesting. And then Rec 2020, again, much, much better. Those patterns generally hold across the spectrum, but some things are a little bit different. Like notice in blues, there's not that much separation. Most P3 values are pretty much the same as sRGB until you get to the very brightest values. Well, that's kind of peculiar. What's going on there? And then over in the magentas and the reds, there's a lot more separation, but you'll notice the reds beyond 70%, things kind of block up. There's no real difference here. You can imagine if we were looking at like a red rose, it's not just that sRGB has a desaturated version of the rose. It's actually going to be a less detailed version. If this is a gradient and I cannot show the upper ranges of it, everything blocks up to the same value, that's going to be kind of a flat looking rose. And that I think is the real value of wide gamut. Yes, I love the more vibrant colors, absolutely. But having the ability to actually see the detail because of that color, that's the most interesting thing for a rose or for a sunset. We can see the cloud shapes. I mean, you really want the wide gamut for detail, not just that extra color. But why are we seeing this? Why is it that blue doesn't have a lot of difference here? And we see these funny things in red where it's kind of blocking up and there are some differences there. Well, if we step back to color sync utility, let's grab P3, let's hold it for comparison, and grab sRGB. From the top-down view, well, obviously there's more saturation for the reds, and there's no real difference for the blues. So that kind of makes sense, right? Obviously there's going to be more saturation there, not there. But it's not the whole story. If we go and flip this and look at the vertical height here, well, now we can see that the reds are not just more saturated for P3, they actually get brighter. And the same thing for blue. It's subtle, it's not a lot, but the blues actually get brighter. And that's why that top last bit of blue is better in P3, even though the rest of P3, for blue anyway, is the same as red. And that's why these three-dimensional color volumes really make a difference. Switching back into Photoshop here, so, kind of bringing things home. You want to be working with the widest gamut you possibly can in your layered file, which would be Rec 2020 or Pro Photo. Pro Photo is a little bit easier because it's just available everywhere in Adobe software, whereas Rec 2020 is not quite as easy to access right now. When you then go to export the image, you don't want to take something like Rec 2020 or Pro Photo, which is okay in 16-bit, and export it for 8 bits. If you're exporting a JPEG at 8 bits, Rec 2020 and Pro Photo can start to ban. So P3 is a better option for sharing until we get to 10-bit formats like AVIF or JXL. And they will work great in a web browser as long as your color is retained. So if you know that your website you're uploading to won't strip the color profile, that's great. And that works really well for P3, and I would go that direction. But if you're unsure, or if you know that it's going to clamp down to sRGB because it strips the profile, that's another consideration. Some websites will actually remove the color profile from your image to make the file a little bit smaller. And that's unfortunate because when that happens, all the numbers in your image don't get converted to sRGB. They're now just wrong. So we already looked at what happens when we convert Rec 2020 down to sRGB. Everything matches the sRGB version. But what if we just throw out the information that says this is a Rec 2020 image? We get a different result. If I go up to Edit, and I'm going to go to Assign Profile. If we take this and just assign it as sRGB, this is what would happen when you strip the profile. Because if the image does not have a profile, sRGB is just simply assumed, right? So when we have the correct color, right now everything would be at the limits of sRGB, and if we had a better monitor, we'd see some differences in the columns, but it would look like this. The moment we throw away the fact that this is a Rec 2020 image, every single value gets desaturated. These sRGB values should be this saturated because we are now at the upper limits of the encoding. So the actual numbers here for RGB are shown here. And so what's happening is when we said we want the maximum green and blue and it was Rec 2020, that was more vibrant. Now we're just saying we want the maximum green and blue. We're not saying the color space. And when it gets interpreted as sRGB, that's what you get. Whereas this was already a lower number. And now in sRGB, it gets desaturated. So some websites are going to discard your profile. And when that happens, it'll get desaturated. So the quick and easy test is just export your image as P3 and then view what came through on the other end. If it looks good, if it didn't desaturate, then P3 is supported. You're in great shape. If it gets damaged, if it gets desaturated, then you should share it as sRGB. It's not as good, but you don't want a damaged file. And if that's what you're up against, you have to do it. And then in the future, when possible, like with AVIF or something down the road, Rec 2020 would be a great choice. But I would just stick with P3 right now, wherever you can. And then wherever you have to, go drop down to sRGB. And now to learn more about working with color, click to this next video.